In 1904, the American Frank Marshall won the Cambridge Spring Super Tournament with a dazzling score of 13 out of 15. That's 11 wins, only 4 draws, and no losses. The reigning world champion Emanuel Lasker also competed in the tournament, finishing tied for second, 2 points back on 11 out of 15. 3 years later, in 1907, the two sat down to play a World Chess Championship match, and it was a debacle. Lasker won 8 games and drew the other 7, winning more than half of the games in the match with no losses. About this debacle, Marshall had only this to say in his autobiography: "Tedious play aimed at wearing down my opponent is averse to my nature." In fact, Lasker did not play in a tedious fashion. He simply played great chess, whatever the circumstances. None other than the great world champion Vladimir Kramnik has described Lasker as the first truly modern Grandmaster strength player in chess history, and we see that on display here. Against a great player in Marshall, he's demonstrating technique and skill in all phases of the game in an era where other players had simply not developed that robust, all-around chess skill yet. Marshall opens the game here with pawn to e4. We get e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. A Roy Lopez classic and exciting stuff. And knight f6 in Berlin. Typically less exciting, but Marshall's going to push the limits of the Berlin from the outset, so we are going to get a dynamic, well-contested game. Pawn to d4, an interesting move. Now, this is objectively not the best, and in fact, black basically equalizes right away if black wants, but there are some lines that are very sharp and allow white some free play, and white is by no means worse in these lines. So if you're looking for a sideline against the Berlin and you want something open, dynamic, maybe this is for you. Now, after pawn to d4 here, a computer anecdote that black might consider is knight takes d4, and c6, an intermediate move. I really like this move. The bishop should fall back, and then black can capture on d4, and including c6 means that d5 will come much more quickly. However, the game is still pretty balanced, and again, it's fairly open, so this is playable for both sides. Instead, after d4, we get pawn takes d4 from Lasker, nothing wrong with it. And castles, Marshall's going for rapid development, castling, hoping to catch Lasker in the center of the board, and Lasker's having none of it. Bishop e7. I'm not going to try and capture this pawn on e4 or anything, which is very risky. I'm just going to play bishop e7. I'm going to castle. I'm fine. e5, can't castle yet, and knight e4, getting ready to castle, and knight takes d4, and Lasker does go ahead and castle. This opening has worked out fairly well for Lasker, though nothing is significantly wrong with the white position either. Knight f5. This is a little bit inaccurate. Now, it's aggressive. The knight looks beautiful on f5, and there's a big threat right here of queen to g4. But it's black's move. The knight on f5 is unstable, so it's the perfect time for a counterstrike in the middle of the board with d5, attacking this knight here on f5. Now, probably best for white was simply capturing on e7 here. You pick up the bishop pair, but black does have a good central position here. This pawn on d5 is very nice. And this e-pawn might be a bit overextended in a number of lines. Maybe if anyone's to be for choice here, it might be black, but both players can play this position. Instead, Marshall plays bishop takes c6, which I really think is a mistake. Now, this does double black's pawns, but you give up the bishop pair to do it, and the doubled pawns are not weak here. This has strengthened Lasker's center. It has also given him a half-open b-file to use, and potentially use of this diagonal for the bishop on c8. In every way, the capture on c6 has improved Lasker's position. This must be some of the tedious positional play that Marshall was referring to, aka good chess play. Now, the knight on f5 is still under attack, so knight captures on e7, queen captures on e7, and now rook to e1. At this point, the computer is looking for something very simple, like rook to e8, even rook to d8, bishop f5, and it says, hey, Lasker will have a good opening advantage with the black pieces. But Lasker decides to go for some tactics, and it should backfire according to the engine, but in practical play, it works perfectly. Queen h4, Queen h4, attacking f2 here, and then the next move, I clicked ahead too far, is bishop e3, defending that f2 pawn. And now pawn to f6. The idea is to just go for a win right out of the gate here. We're trying to rip open the f file, and pawn to f3 from Marshall. At this point, Lasker's clearly calculated the next sequence. If the knight has to fall back from e4, then everything has really backfired quite significantly. The knight doesn't have a good square to fall back to. Knight g5 is very awkward, and then moves like bishop c5 are strong for white. The black play would make no sense if the knight fell back. Lasker has prepared f takes e5, which is a very interesting piece sacrifice, which creates a lot of ways to go wrong. After f takes e5, we get the capture of the knight, accepting the piece sacrifice, and the point, pawn to d4 here. The bishop on e3 is under attack, and it doesn't really have anywhere good to go. In fact, white has to give back the bishop. The question is how? Why does white have to give back the bishop? Well, if, for example, bishop to c1, pulling the bishop back to safety, then black gets access to f2. And getting access to f2 actually just wins, because if king h1, then you have bishop to g4. Very strong, attacking the queen here, and there's no way for the queen to defend e1 and the mate on f1. And yeah, just decisive for Lasker. So, backing up, the right way to give back the piece here is simply queen e2 or queen d2, basically the same thing. And maybe you could look for some tactics here, but they don't really work. Like bishop a6, you're like, please take this, and then I'm going to take here. And in fact, bishop g5 is a very nice antidote here, because white is up a piece. You just need to make sure there's no queen f2 or queen e1. The trade of bishops will win for white. So here, after queen e2, it becomes necessary to capture on e3. And after queen takes e3, this is by no means over. It's not like white has won the game, but now the double pawns are really actually quite bad. Earlier in the game, when they were supporting a pawn on d5, it was great. But the transformation here, where all of the black pawns over here on the center and queen side have become isolated, is hugely in Marshall's favor. If he was actually willing to play tedious play and grind down his opponent, he would have a decent chance here. It's just a great position for white. But this is not in his style. It's not in his kind of positional strategic repertoire. And instead, he makes a huge error here and plays the move pawn g3. Honestly, a blunder at this level of chess. It doesn't change the tactics in his favor. So all it succeeds in doing is weakening the light squares here. Now, there are actually two good moves for Lasker. One here is to play queen to h3. And I want to point this one out just because it highlights how weak these light squares are. In this position, if the bishop tries to save itself, you actually have rook f2, which is amazing, and it forces checkmate. A brilliant move, a sacrifice on an empty square. Obviously, you must accept it because of the mates over here. And after king takes, then you just have queen takes h2, and if king f1, there is bishop not g4, bishop h3, checkmate over here. Again, the light squares are falling apart. And after king takes f2, queen takes h2 check. If the king pulls up to f3 here, then we have bishop to h3. And the idea here is rook to f8 checkmate, or queen to g2 checkmate. And there's no holding against these checkmate threats. The light squares collapse. The inclusion of g3 has been a disaster. So, backing up, that's not what was played. But, oh, rook f2 is so beautiful. I have to show it, right? Instead, after g3, we get another idea that is also very effective, and that is queen to f6. And the point is, this bishop can't move because, again, if bishop c1, I get queen to f2 check, king h1, and bishop g4. You cannot defend f3, d1, e1. It's all collapsing, and Lasker wins. So after queen f6, Marshall realizes, I've got to give the piece back. And he does so with bishop takes d4, but now pawn takes d4 gives a much better position to Lasker in terms of not having an isolated pawn over here, but instead having a strong pawn here. And now the e4 pawn is isolated on an open file. As a result, the transition into the endgame is favorable for Lasker. And it's also basically forced because we have these threats. The bishop is looking to come in. If you keep the queens on the board, you're just losing right away. So rook f1, queen takes, rook takes, king takes. We are in this endgame now. And it's a clear advantage for Lasker. He's not going to checkmate, but he's just going to be able to work with a bishop versus a knight. This is a much stronger bishop than the knight. He's going to be able to use the half-open files. He's going to be able to tease Marshall on both sides of the board. He's going to be able to activate his king. Everything is in Lasker's favor, and he puts it all to good use here. We get rook b8. Now pawn to b3, basically forced. Rook b5. I love the mobility of the rook here. Very, very instructive. And now pawn to c4, a really significant concession. Here, necessary was pawn to c3. And in this position, it's still something where white can resist. It's not a good position for white. There's a lot of good moves here. For example, rook e5 is just very natural. But this is a position in which white can resist. After pawn to c4 here, of course, we're not capturing en passant and allowing the knight to capture back. We're just going to leave all of this over here, and we're going to go tickle on the king side with rook h5, king to g1, and pawn to c5. This is a protected passed pawn. That's obviously a huge advantage. Now, if Marshall could get the knight to d3, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. The knight would be an amazing blockader on d3. But this position where a knight is 2 squares diagonally away from the desired target square is one where it's almost impossible. It takes forever. It takes 4 moves to get the knight to that square. Remember this construction because it's so hard to get a knight from the square it's on to the square that's 2 diagonal squares away. You need to play like knight a3, knight to c2, knight to e1, knight to d3, and there will never ever be time for it. So we get knight to d2, king to f7. The king is headed to this beautiful square right here. Rook f1 check. The king steps over to e7, staying out of the way of this bishop. Pawn to a3, rook to h6. The 5th rank was great for maneuvering the rook on a moment ago, but now it's the 6th rank that becomes super useful. h4, rook over to a6, a little tickle here. And now rook a1, staying passive because Marshall doesn't want to play pawn to a4 and lock this in. He wants to try to get b4 in, but he's not going to be able to do it. Bishop to g4, keeping the knight out of f3. And now king f2, king to e6. Can the knight come to f3 here? In this position, bishop takes, king e5 is actually an easy win. So the bishop is dominating the knight here. In this position, the rook coming over to f6 just means that Lasker is going to be able to infiltrate here to win the e4 pawn, and there will be no holding the position. As a result, backing up right here, there's no way to get the knight to any desirable square, and the bishop is just rocking it, controlling these squares right here. So pawn to a4, saying, all right, I can't leave my rook here forever defending this pawn. King to e5. The pawn on e4 is under fire. King g2. Of course, pay attention to the use of the active king in the endgame. King g2, rook over to f6. And one thing to note is that you're never really going to be able to go for moves like this because more trades are only going to make it easier for Lasker to win the game as he accumulates more advantages. So you're just sitting tight, but Lasker has ways to improve the position. Rook e1, pawn to d3. We can still activate the king further. Why shouldn't we? And of course, the pawn being on d3 means that promotion becomes more of a real possibility in some lines. And bishop to e2. We're just going to stick this bishop here, which is beautiful. Rook f1, king to d4, saying, hey, doesn't really help you to trade off the rooks. That's true, but there's nothing better. So rook takes f6, pawn takes f6. Note in this game how Lasker is always comfortable with transforming his advantage. He switches to a sound position in the middle, to an attack that may have been slightly unsound, but works out really well. And then he's willing to transform advantages in terms of activating his rook, but then allowing it to be traded off if he can gain time to bring the king in and activate it further. So he's constantly letting the position evolve, but each evolution of the position favors him. King f2, pawn to c6, basically saying, hey, you can't do anything. I'll make this move that slightly improves my position. a5, a6, running white out of moves. And knight back to b1. The knight or king had to move. If the king moves, there's infiltration. But when the knight moves, the e4 pawn falls. So Lasker picks it off. King to e1, bishop to e2, cementing the bishop here and looking to come over with king to f3 and then just mop up. So now knight d2 check, king into e3, knight to b1. This is basically just a nasty, nasty zugzwang. Pawn to f5. You know, I can keep improving forever. When are you going to resign? Knight to d2, pawn to h5, knight to b1. Finally, after these pawns are advanced, we have king over to f3. Total patience from Lasker. Knight c3, king takes g3. And you can capture a pawn here, but it doesn't really matter. You're giving up on the king side totally, but it's totally over anyway. Knight a4, trying for counterplay on the queen side. Pawn to f4, knight takes e5, pawn to f3, looking to play f2 and then make a new queen. So knight e4 check, king f4, knight to d6, pawn to c5. What are you going to do? b4, just capture that. Boom, we have a new way to make a queen. Pawn c5, b3, knight c4. The knight's trying to hold everything back over here. King g3, how are you holding back this other pawn? I have 3 passers 2 squares away from promotion. Knight e3, so that if f2, king d2, I can at least capture over here, but that's not played. Instead, we just get pawn to b2, and faced with b1 equals queen and checkmate in just a few more moves, Marshall resigned. This is such a dominant illustration of the power of the active king, the strength of the bishop versus the knight, the power of the protected passed pawn, the strength of the rook and the mobility along the 5th and then the 6th ranks. This is one of the most instructive endgames ever, and you see why Kramnik said that Lasker was kind of the first truly modern grandmaster in strength. And this is just such an imbalance in class. And much as it might not seem like it from my analysis here, I love Marshall, but he is just outclassed in this game. Everyone should read his autobiography. It's thrilling chess, but he is just outclassed in this game. I hope you've enjoyed Lasker's demonstration of technique here. If you want to see more of my favorite chess games from the 1900s, click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen.